Skill 5, Sentence Completion, Questions 1 to 4. Listen to the audio, complete the sentences. Write no more than 3 words for each answer.
And what about the other things, that are included in the price?
Oh, there are lots of things. If you don't want to do the whale watch cruise, your guide will take anyone who is interested either on a bushwalk through the national park near the hotel, and there's no extra charge for that, or on a fishing trip. That's an extra $12, I think. And there's also a reptile park in town. That costs more or less the same.
No, I think I'd prefer whales to snakes.
Yeah. And if you just want to relax, you're free to sit by the hotel pool or go down the beach. Oh, and they also have tennis courts at the hotel, but you have to pay for those by the hour. But there are table tennis tables downstairs, and they're part of the accommodation package. Just speak to your guide.
Well, that sounds good. So how much is the basic tour price?
At this time of year, it's usually around $300, but let me check. It's actually $280.
And the next tour, are there any places on that one?
How many people is it for?
There are 2 of us.
Yes, that should be fine. Can I just mention that we require all bookings to be made at least 14 days before you travel to avoid cancellations of tours? And if you cancel within 7 days of departure, you will have to pay 50% of your total booking.
Okay.
And you also need to pay a 20% deposit at the time of booking.
Can I pay that by credit card?
Yes, you can.
All right. What I'll do is I'll talk to my partner and get back to you.
Fine. So I'll make a provisional booking, shall I? 2 for the whale watch experience. Let me issue you with a customer reference number for when you call back. Do you have a pen?
Yes.
Okay. It's 39745T. That's T for Tango. When you call back, ask to speak to the tour manager. That's me, Tracy.
Fine, I will.
Questions 5 to 7. Listen to the audio, complete the sentences. Write 1 word only for each answer.
Thanks, Philip. So now I guess the 2 main things to remember here are to identify individual talent and then to utilize it. So, Janice, you were looking at identifying different talents in workers. Do you think this is easy for managers to do?
Well, currently, teamwork is in fashion in the workplace, and in my opinion, the importance of the individual is generally neglected. What managers should be targeting is those employees who can take the lead in a situation and are not afraid to accept the idea of responsibility.
That's true, Janice, but unfortunately, many managers think the entire notion of encouraging individuality amongst their staff is far too hard.
Yes, that may be true, but I think one of the most important tasks of managers is to consider the needs of the individual on one hand, and group cooperation and conformity on the other. It requires creative thinking on the part of management to avoid tension.
So, Janice, what kind of people do you think companies should be looking for?
Well, it has to start from the very beginning, when companies are looking for new employees. When the personnel department is choosing between applicants, they need to look for someone who's broken the mould and can think for themselves. Instead, people making these decisions often use a range of psychological tests to see if a person is a problem solver or will do as they're told. I'm not convinced these qualities are actually the most important.
So do you think being a good team player is overrated?
No, it's not overrated. You do need to learn the rules and learn them fast. No individual can get around this if you're working in an organisation.
So how should managers deal with this?
Rewards. When an individual demonstrates the behaviour the organisation expects, some kind of incentive can be given. What's important here is that this happens right at the beginning, so new recruits learn the rules of the system immediately. Also, the incentive should be something the individual actually wants, and this isn't always just money.
To come back to you, Philip, you were saying that recognition of good performers is essential. Now, what else should managers be looking for?
Well, managing people means you not only have an understanding of your employees, but you also recognise the culture of the organisation. In fact, for some organisations, creativity and individuality may be the last thing they want to see during working hours.
Very true.
Yes, but managing people isn't as easy as it looks. For example, change in the workplace can be quite tricky, especially if there's a need to increase profit. And at times like these, managers may have to give priority to profit rather than individual staff needs.
Yes, and that creates difficult situations for people.
Yes, but what's important is that managers are able to deal with quite high levels of personal stress. During times of change, they should be thinking not only about the strain on their staff, but take time out to think of themselves.
Absolutely. So, what are the implications of that?
Questions 8 to 10. Listen to the audio. Complete the sentences. Write one word only for each answer.
Hello, Kira. How are you?
Fine, thanks, Paul. How are you?
Well, thanks. It's good to see you. It must be 12 months since you did our course.
That's right. It's nice to come back and say hello.
What course did you enroll in?
Actually, I went straight into third-year pharmacy. They credited me with 2 years, which probably made it more difficult for me.
On the other hand, you were lucky to be granted credits. Is that why you chose the course?
Yes, and as I'd already finished a course in it in my country, I thought it would be easier if I studied something I already knew.
I didn't realize you went into third year. I thought you started in first year. No wonder it was so hard. And what do you think is one of the big differences between studying at a university here and studying in your country?
Well, I found it very difficult to write assignments because I wasn't familiar with that aspect of the system here. The main problem is that the lectures expect you to be critical. That made me feel really terrible. I thought, how can I possibly do it? How can I comment on someone else's research when they probably spent 5 years doing it? I think a lot of people who come from overseas countries have similar problems. But after a while, it became easier for me. People expect you to have problems with the process of reading and writing, but in fact, it is more a question of altering your viewpoint towards academic study.
How was the content of the lectures? Was it easy for you?
I didn't really have many problems understanding lectures. The content was very similar to what I'd studied before.
And what about the lecturers themselves? Are they essentially the same as lecturers in your country?
Well, actually, no. Here they're much easier to approach. After every lecture, you can go and ask them something you didn't understand, or you can make an appointment and talk to them about anything in the course.
Maybe you found them different because you're a more mature student now, whereas when you were studying in your country, you were younger and not so assertive.
No, I don't think that's the difference. Most of the students here do it. In my faculty, they all seem to make appointments, usually to talk about something in the course that's worrying them, but sometimes just about something that might really interest them, something they might want to specialize in. The lecturers must set aside certain times every week when they're available for students.
That's good to hear.
Questions 11 to 13. Listen to the audio. Complete the sentences. Write one word only for each answer.
Interesting. Right, let's look at the content of your proposal now.
Did you find it comprehensive enough?
Well, yes and no. You've listed several different topics on your contents page, but I'm not sure they're all relevant.
No? Well, I thought that from the perspective of a field trip, one thing I needed to focus on was the sandstone plateau and cliffs themselves. The way they tower up from the flat landscape is just amazing. The fact that the surrounding softer rocks were eroded by wind and rain, leaving these huge outcrops high above the plain. It's hardly surprising that tourists flock to see the area.
Well, yes, I'd agree with including those points.
And then the fact that it's been home to Native American Navajos and all the social history that goes with that. The hardships they endured trying to save their territory from the invading settlers. Their culture is so rich. All those wonderful stories.
Well, I agree it's interesting, but it's not immediately relevant to your proposal, Sandra, so at this stage, I suggest you focus on other considerations. I think an indication of what the students on the trip could actually do when they get there should be far more central, so that certainly needs to be included and to be expanded upon. And I'd like to see something about the local wildlife and vegetation, too. Not that I imagine there's much to see. Presumably the tourist invasion hasn't helped.
Okay, I'll do some work on those two areas as well. But you're right, there's not much apart from some very shallow-rooted species. Although it's cold and snowy there in the winter, the earth is baked so hard in the summer sun that rainwater can't penetrate. So it's a case of flood or drought, really.
So I understand. Now, before we look at everything in more detail, I've got a few factual questions for you. It would be a good idea to include the answers in your finished proposal, because they're missing from your draft.
Fine.
So you mentioned the monoliths and the spires, which was good. But what area does the tribal park cover? Do you know?
12,000 hectares, and the plain is at about 5,850 meters above sea level.
Larger than I expected. Okay, where's the nearest accommodation? That's a practical detail that you haven't included. Have you done any research on that?
Yes. There's nowhere to stay in the park itself, but there's an old trading post called Goulding quite near. All kinds of tours start from Goulding, too.
What kind of tours?
Well, the most popular are in four-wheel drive Jeeps, but I wouldn't recommend hiring those. I think the best way to appreciate the area would be to hire horses instead and trek around on those. Biking is not allowed, and it's impossible to drive around the area in private vehicles. The tracks are too rough.
Okay. Lastly, what else is worth visiting there?
There are several caves, but I haven't looked into any details. I'll find out about them.
Okay, good. Now what I'd like to know is more about...
Questions 14 to 16. Listen to the audio. Complete the sentences. Write no more than 3 words for each answer.
So now there was a real possibility of having films of more than 2 or 3 minutes. And this led to the making of the Great Train Robbery, the very first movie made. It only lasted 11 minutes, but was an absolute sensation. And there were cases of people watching the movie and actually fainting when the character fired a gun at the camera. Almost overnight, movies became a craze. And by 1905, people in America were lining up to see movies in store theaters, as they were called then. I guess the next big step in terms of development of technology was to have people actually talking on the film. And the first step towards this was in 1926, when sound effects were first used on a film. It wasn't until the following year, however, that the first
talkie, as they were called then, was made. This film featured actors speaking only during parts of the film and was called The Jazz Singer. And it wasn't until 1928 that the first all-talking film was produced, and this was called The Lights of New York. Unfortunately, the sound on this early film was not very good, and I believe they put subtitles on the film. That is, they printed the dialogue along the bottom of the film to compensate for this poor sound quality. Now, with the addition of sound, moving pictures became far more difficult to make.